Hey, what's going on with you guys? This is Adrian Johnson coming at you, just letting you know what you're getting ready to watch. This was actually supposed to be an unreleased episode of my initial episode of Blerd It Out. And the reason why I wanted to just go ahead and put it out now is, I had shelved it for my own reasons in terms of, editing, a whole multitude of reasons, to just put it aside. But I recently was looking over my files and I came across it, and I just decided, what, I'll just go ahead and put it out. There is some charm to it, but anyway, take a look at it. Let me know what you guys think. It's about my favorite all-time single issue of any comic book, which is Daredevil 181 by Frank Miller and Klaus Janson. So, take a look. Let me know what you think. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks.
Welcome back to this episode, the inaugural episode of Blerd It Out. I'm your host, Adrian Johnson, and this is the beginning of a new series that I'm debuting here on the Inazuma Studios channel, just where I'll be reviewing some of my favorite all-time comics, comic book runs, and other geeky ephemera that strike my fancy. And I wanted to start this particular episode with one of my favorite all-time comic books, favorite single issue ever of anything, ever. And this right here does it for me every time. It's Daredevil, The Man Without Fear, issue 181 from 1982 by Frank Miller and Klaus Janson. Now, before we go any further, let me tell you this. Frank Miller, Klaus Janson, one of my all-time favorite creative teams. I mean, you have Miller as just this, young, fresh, upstart penciler who also becomes a really fantastic writer, telling these very noir tales of, violence in the city and, just these other, I guess you would call them tropes per se, that he really makes his own with the infusion of martial arts, ninjas, just everything that was kind of in that heyday that was, kind of popular, he brings it to Daredevil. And you have Klaus Janson with his, idiosyncratic inking, but that was just so solid and brought out the grit and in some regards, I'll say the sexiness of Daredevil. I mean, there's just something magic about these two going together. I mean, they're like Lennon and McCartney, Joe Strummer and Mick Jones, Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. You know what I'm saying? They just go together, and it's just a perfect match. And I think here in Daredevil 181 is the apex of their creative powers as a team. Now, obviously, they would go on to other things, of course, Batman, The Dark Knight Returns, and several more issues hereafter in this particular run. But for me, this is it. It's kind of like this almost ends the run for me, even though there are several more issues in their particular run together. So let's get ready to dive into this. This is Daredevil, issue 181 by Frank Miller and Klaus Janson. And let's start with the cover. The cover is very evocative. I think it's one of those classic covers that you can't do without. It's up there. And if you think about it, the striking element is that it's yellow. It's a yellow cover. How often, especially these days with the advent of, digital coloring and so forth, do you really see a cover that has a pure primary yellow color on it? And I think this is what makes it striking. It's the yellow color set in contrast against the framing element of Daredevil himself being in red, and it frames the figures of Bullseye and Elektra, just as the cover states. Bullseye versus Elektra. One wins, one dies. But it's just a perfect cover. I mean, everything works on this. So even when I see the cover, elsewhere online, if I'm just, browsing and whatnot, even just the cover, really gives me gives me that brief charge, that brief rush. You know what I'm saying? I just love it so much. And this is not the only time in Daredevil, in the run of Daredevil by Miller and Janson, that they actually used this particular scheme. There were actually two other times I can name off the top of my head where they used this yellow background buttressed against like the red of one of the characters. You have, if I'm not mistaken, it's Daredevil 183. 182, no, 184. My apologies. It's Daredevil 184, and it's Daredevil holding this 357 Magnum right at you, the reader, and the quotation says, "No more Mr. Nice Guy." And it's a yellow background. It's Daredevil in red with the Magnum. And there's also a another Daredevil issue. I want to say it's maybe 179 off the top of my head again, and it's Elektra. Yellow background, close up of Elektra and one of her side holding the punctured mask of Daredevil. And it's just awesome. And I think that scheme really works. And, you know, something like this would pop off the stands today. But, you know, that's neither here nor there. You know, I'm just an old school guy, you know, a lot of respect. So, you know, what can I say? But yeah, just the cover, just awesome. And so now let's get into the guts of this. All right, so here we start with the opening splash page of Bullseye taking one to the dome, ostensibly at the hand of Bullseye. And coincidentally, he is in the middle of a bullseye. It's just great framing, a great precursor to the rest of the issue, just in terms of, you know, these two being mortal enemies. It's a theme that reverberates throughout the issue on to the end, and it's something that continues throughout the series as a main theme. It was established before Miller came on, but, you know, definitely Miller was the one who took it to, you know, the height of, you know, these guys really being like, you know, Bullseye possibly, you know, his main rogue, you know, similar to the Joker to Batman or so forth. The other thing about this particular splash is that you can clearly see the influence of Gil Kane here, the famous comic book artist, Gil Kane, just in terms of the anatomy and the posing that Miller employs here. You can also see the influence of George Bridgman. George Bridgman is an artist who came out with a series of books in the early 20th century. I think one of the books, the main one that people refer to is Constructive Anatomy, and you know, a lot of you'll see the influence of Bridgman for a lot of superhero artists, primarily, definitely someone like Jim Lee and quite a few others. Just the way that the figure is blocked in to make it dynamic, you know, you can definitely see that influence of Bridgman here. All right, and on the next page, we have a close-up. It starts with a close-up of Bullseye's eyes as he is locked up in Rikers Island. And what's interesting is that this close-up of the eyes is something that will come back around at the end of this issue. So it's a good... So it's just a good motif, very nice motif that Miller employs here with this. And in particular, I always like this last panel on the page with this close-up of Bullseye. You know, it almost looks like German expressionism in a sense, just the starkness of the image, you know, with the light, you know, hitting the his left side of his face, and, you know, the shadow on his right side of his face. And just really, really nice. And I should mention that the process here that is being employed by Klaus Janson in terms of the shading on his face is a process called duotone. Duotone back in the day, it was more prevalent back in the, I'd say, like the 60s through probably the late 80s, maybe the early 90s. And what duotone is that you would draw on this special type of paper, and there's a pattern, quote unquote, hidden in the paper in terms of a type of design, or like a screen tone almost. And the only way that you could release that screen tone hidden in the paper is by the use of this special fluid that you would have to brush on or apply to the paper, and that would reveal this particular print. And you saw a lot of this definitely back in the late 60s, like I mentioned, through the early 90s, just in terms of having another tool in the toolbox to relay shading that you couldn't do, by hand, so to speak, in terms of the actual inking. And I really get a kick out of that. I love that type of stuff. And unfortunately, that's one of the things that now you could probably do in Photoshop, but it looks great on the original art. If you ever have a chance to check out original art examples online, and you see duotone applied, I mean, it's just really nice. He's in the yard, of Rikers. He gets his rec time, and he spends it by himself because he still has that much of a reputation. And so we see this guy starting to walk over, and one of the other prisoners tries to stop him, but he's like, "Whoa, I recognize you." He's trying to stop him from seeing Bullseye, thinking that Bullseye is lethal. He's going to kill him. But he recognizes this guy as the Punisher, Frank Castle, the Punisher. And always really loved this exchange. It's like, this is the Punisher's character in a nutshell right here. The Punisher approaches Bullseye to tell him that the Kingpin, Bullseye's now former employer, has gotten a new assassin to take his place, which is Elektra. And Bullseye is like, "Well, why are you telling me this? What do you get out of it?" And this exchange right here, chances are you'll do something dumb, get yourself killed. I'd like that. Perfect. That's the Punisher. That's the Punisher right there. You know what I'm saying? So it's just like, man, damn, Miller really nailed that. Just that little piece, says so much. And so Bullseye concocts a plan when he's interviewed by this television host, and he escapes from prison. And he is back on the loose in New York. Matt Murdock gets home from work. He's probably just like, man, I'm about to sit here and chill. Listens to the radio, saying Bullseye's escaped, and out the skylight he goes, the skylight of his brownstone. Now this is one of my favorite pages that Miller has kind of ever done. I know that seems like hyperbole, but look at the design on it. It kind of presages some of the design elements that Miller would later use to greater effect in some of his works in the future. But here, look at this and think about this. If you look at it, the page itself is actually designed so you start here, you go down, and it's the narration also. And it shows Bullseye in his flop house. But as you go down, you get to the middle here, the full figure of Bullseye, and so your eye transitions over in the reading order. Just flows so naturally. And goes down to this next tier. You can almost imagine too. Here's some of Miller's genius. If you were to imagine more panels going in these negative spaces, they would fill out, and it would be almost a full 16 panels or so forth, thereabouts. And the negative space is something that Miller would use to great effect, and you would see it next in his Wolverine miniseries run, and a few other Future Comics work. And then you would see in Dark Knight Returns where Miller would actually use more of a 16 panel grid, where he's using the television as a motif, as not only a design motif but also as a panel design to kind of break down the flow of the page as well. So you can already see here, as early as 1982, with this particular issue, some of Miller's future, decisions as far as his art making. And then let me stop right here. This issue in particular has some of the best choreographed fights, that I'd seen in comic. Whew, man, the fight between Bullseye and Elektra in the parking garage here is just, man, it's brutal as it is beautifully choreographed. Miller really outshines himself here, and it's almost so well done that it's easy to forget how brutal it is. I mean, these two are going at it, and it leads up to obviously one of the most famous comic book panels in the history of the medium. And then you have this sequence where she is making her way back to Matt Murdock's apartment, and Bullseye is just following her the whole way, and it ends with her on the steps of Matt's apartment, and Matt comes out, and it's just this great sequence of Matt looking, but he can't look. He's blind, of course, but he's just staring out, but he knows that Elektra is dying and that she's dead. And so he holds her seemingly for hours there on the doorstep. And you have all these bystanders who are aghast and appalled. And Bullseye just nonchalantly lights a smoke as he's dispatched Elektra. I mean, it's just a perfect, man, that scene is just gives me goosebumps. You know what I'm saying? And then with the final battle with Daredevil and Bullseye, after he finds out that Matt Murdock is actually Daredevil and goes to the brownstone. Now notice the whole time that Daredevil is fighting Bullseye, he is absolutely silent. He's not saying a damn thing. He's just taking it to Bullseye. And this is a culmination of a number of things that have occurred through the run. Not only are they two players on the opposite side of the same coin, so to speak, but also this is the murderer of his once lover and someone that he still apparently has feelings for. And just the whole thing of that Bullseye is just a maniacal killer, period. So he has to be put down. So there's a myriad of levels here to this particular battle instead of just merely good and evil. And, again, just so well choreographed. I mean, they go from Matt Murdock's brownstone. They crash through a skylight into this warehouse. They get it on these railroad tracks, and hold on to a train, and then they're above the city on electrical wires, kind of like a tightrope, and it's just perfect. I mean, and Daredevil jumps, shakes the wire, Bullseye trips and falls, but Daredevil catches him, because inherently Daredevil is still good, but Bullseye will not allow Daredevil to save him. He even says, "You won't save me, not like before," because Daredevil had saved his life previously back in issue 169. Again, he had pulled him off some railroad tracks as a subway train was coming. So he saved his life before. But even here, even though this man has murdered his lover, murdered his former girlfriend, murdered, countless people, Daredevil still saves his life. Bullseye says, "You won't save me again." And Daredevil says, "Well, fine then," and just lets him go. And he just falls and just crunches against the hard concrete below. And the end of the issue, it ends with the eyes, this close-up of Bullseye. The Kingpin has written him off. He's killed Elektra, and Bullseye was back in line to become Kingpin's assassin again. But now that he's dispatched, the Kingpin has no use for either one of them, you know? And it's just, he burns his file. But Bullseye is also thinking that, hey, even though I might be messed up, I think for some reason, Daredevil, you got yours too, you know? And he's just picturing in his mind, even though in reality, we see Matt Murdock at Elektra's grave, and it's just snowing, and Matt Murdock is just standing there. But the true ending is we discover that Bullseye is in traction, and he's sitting in this hospital room, you know, just bandaged up. He can't move. The world's deadliest assassin, unable to do a thing. And he's just thinking. You just see the close-up of his eyes. And here's where, you know, the coloring and Janson's inking and Miller's pacing all come together and congeal. It's Bullseye just sitting there, just laying there, just saying, just wait. Just wait. And the issue ends. Now, that is one of my favorite issues. Like I said, I can't overstate that enough. You know, this, man.